Clara Whitmore pressed her hands flat against her skirt to stop them from shaking. She had walked 3 miles in the summer heat, alone, to knock on the door of the most powerful man in Harrington County. Not to ask for anything. To kneel. To apologize for a lie her sister told. To beg a stranger not to destroy what little her family had left. She never expected him to open that door himself. She never expected him to look at her, really look, and say, "You're the wrong Whitmore, but maybe you're the right one." If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very last word, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Clara Whitmore knew it was bad before she even broke the wax seal, because her mother had already started crying in the kitchen, and her mother only cried when there was nothing left to say. She read it standing at the window, the summer sun cutting hard across the floorboards of their small house at the edge of Whitmore land. What remained of it anyway? 3 sentences. That was all it took to understand that her family was finished. Mr. William Harrington of Harrington Estate demands a formal apology to be delivered in person by a member of the Whitmore family regarding the matter of Miss Josephine Whitmore's public statements made on the 14th of June, 1817. Failure to appear within 7 days will result in the matter being forwarded to the county magistrate. He does not negotiate through letters. Clara set the paper down on the sill. She turned to look at her mother, then at Josephine, who was sitting at the kitchen table pretending to mend a stocking. Her eyes cast down, her jaw tight with the particular stubbornness of someone who knew they were wrong and had already decided not to say so. "Josie," Clara said, "don't." "What exactly did you say about him?" Josephine stabbed the needle through the fabric. "I said what everyone already thinks. That he drives men off his land. That he doesn't pay fair wages. That Thomas Caldwell told me." "Thomas Caldwell," Clara repeated. Her voice came out flat. "You repeated something Thomas Caldwell told you in public about William Harrington. At the Mercers' Sunday supper. It wasn't... In front of how many people?" Josephine was quiet. "Josie, in front of how many people?" 14, maybe 15. Clara pressed her fingers against her forehead. Outside, a horse was moving slow along the road, the sound of hooves dull in the summer heat. She thought about the ledger sitting on her father's desk, the one she'd been working through for 3 nights running, trying to find a way to make the numbers say something other than what they said. The Whitmore farm was already mortgaged twice over. Her father's health had been poor for 2 years. Their creditor, one Marcus Beale of Richmond, had been patient, but not infinitely so. And now this. A formal complaint from William Harrington, the man who owned the largest tobacco estate in the county, who had more political connections than God and less tolerance for slander than anyone Clara had ever heard of, was the one thing they could not afford. "You have to go," her mother said from the kitchen doorway. She wasn't talking to Josephine. She was looking at Clara. Clara looked back at her. "Mama, you're the only one he might listen to." Her mother's voice broke, then steadied. "You're the only one who talks sense. Josie can't go. You know she'd only make it worse. And your father can't ride. Clara." She pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment. "Please." That was how it started. Not with a choice. With a please that had no other word behind it. Clara left at dawn. She didn't take the carriage. There wasn't enough feed for the horse to make the full 10 miles and back in the heat, and she wouldn't waste it. She wore her good gray dress, the one she kept pressed in the cedar chest for church and funerals, and she braided her hair back tight and pinned it so it would hold through the walk. She carried nothing except her father's leather satchel, inside of which she had placed 3 things: a copy of the original letter from Harrington's solicitor, a written apology she had drafted herself at the kitchen table the night before, and the real ledger from the Whitmore farm. Because if William Harrington was going to make demands, she intended to understand exactly what position she was walking into. She was 26 years old. She had managed her family's land accounts since she was 19, when her father's eyes began failing, and Josephine had made it clear she had no patience for numbers. She had stretched harvests that shouldn't have stretched. She had negotiated with suppliers who thought they could take advantage of a woman's signature on a contract, and she had been right often enough that they stopped trying. She was not afraid of powerful men. She was afraid of what happened to her family if she failed. That was different. That was the kind of fear that made her walk faster. Harrington Estate sat at the end of a long drive lined with old oaks, their branches meeting overhead so that the path through was cool and shadowed even in full summer. Clara had seen the roof of the house from the road before, but she had never been inside the gates. The gate was iron, and it was open. She walked through it without slowing down. The house itself was large. 3 stories of red brick, wide white columns across the front, a yard that was orderly without being ornamental. Working land. The kind of property that existed to produce something, not to impress. Clara noted that without deciding to. It was the way she looked at everything. She climbed the front steps and knocked. She expected a housekeeper. She expected to be made to wait. She expected, if she was being honest, to be turned away at the door and told that Mr. Harrington did not receive women who arrived on foot without an appointment. The door opened. The man on the other side was not a housekeeper. He was tall, dark-haired, somewhere in his middle 30s, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition. Something in between, like a man who had been expecting one thing and found himself holding another. He said, "Miss Whitmore." It was not a question. Clara said, "Mr. Harrington?" He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than was polite. Then he stepped back from the door and said, "Come in." His study was at the back of the house, a long room with a desk covered in papers and 2 windows that looked out over the fields. He didn't offer her tea. He didn't offer her a seat, not at first. He walked to his desk and stood behind it, which Clara recognized as a tactic, the desk as barrier, the standing as dominance, and she decided immediately not to be managed by it. She sat down in the chair across from him without being invited. He noticed. Something shifted very slightly at the corner of his mouth. "I expected your father," he said. "My father is unwell." "I expected your sister." "My sister," Clara said carefully, "is the reason I'm here. She is not the person you want speaking on this matter. She tends toward emotion. I don't. Is that so?" He sat down behind the desk. He folded his hands on top of a paper and looked at her with the patient, measuring attention of a man who was used to waiting people out. "Then tell me, Miss Whitmore, what is it you came to say?" Clara opened the satchel. She removed the written apology and placed it on the desk facing him. "That is a formal retraction of every statement my sister made publicly regarding your business practices and your treatment of workers on your land. She made those statements without evidence, and on the basis of gossip she received from a man whose motivations I will address in a moment. The apology is genuine. She was wrong to say what she said, and she knows it." He picked up the paper. He read it. He set it down. "And the man whose motivations you'll address in a moment," he said. "Thomas Caldwell." His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "Go on." "Caldwell has been buying up farmland along the northern ridge for 3 years. He's done it by undermining the credibility of the current owners, spreading rumors, engineering disputes, making it financially and socially untenable for people to stay. 2 families on Ridgeline Road sold to him last year at a loss because they couldn't withstand the pressure." Clara paused. "Your land borders the northern ridge. Your reputation is the main thing standing between you and his next move." My sister didn't understand that when she repeated what he told her. She was used. The silence in the room was long. William Harrington looked at her the way people looked at things they hadn't expected to find where they were looking. "You arrived at that conclusion, how?" he asked. "I manage our farm's accounts. I know every land transaction in this county for the past decade, because I have to. I know who owes what to whom and why, and I know what Caldwell's pattern looks like because I've watched him do it twice already to people who couldn't stop him." She met his eyes. "We're not rich enough to be his target. You are." And Josephine handed him exactly what he needed. Harrington was quiet for a moment. He picked up a pen and turned it between his fingers, not writing, just thinking. "You're not here to beg," he said. "No." "What are you here to do?" "Correct the record. give you the tools to defend against Caldwell if you didn't already have them, and ask you, in return, to let this matter rest without involving the magistrate. Because a legal proceeding would cost my family what little we have left, and my father is not well enough to survive the stress of it. That's the honest truth of where we stand." She waited. He turned the pen over once more. He set it down. "Your ledger," he said, nodding at the satchel. "Is that what else you brought?" She paused. "You can see it from across the desk?" "I can see it's a ledger from the shape of the spine. What I can't see is whether it tells the story you're telling me or a different one." Clara opened the satchel and placed the ledger on the desk. He reached for it. She let him. Howe was quiet for 8 minutes by the clock on the mantel. Clara knew because she counted them. He turned pages without speaking, his face giving nothing away, and she sat across from him and kept her hands still in her lap and did not fidget, because fidgeting was how you told a man you were afraid of him. Then he turned back to a page near the middle and said, without looking up, "This entry here, August of 1814. You've got an outgoing payment of $40 to a Benjamin Hale, listed as farm supply, but there's no corresponding delivery in the inventory log." Clara blinked. "What?" "Page 11, your inventory log, August 1814, no delivery from Hale." She stood up and came around to his side of the desk, which she suspected was not something many people did uninvited, but the alternative was asking him to hold the book up, and that was worse. She leaned over and looked at the page he was pointing to. He was right. She looked at the August inventory, then back at the payment log. Then she straightened up slowly, because she had gone over that ledger 3 times in the past month, and she had not caught that. "That's $40, she said. "That's—" She stopped. She thought back. August 1814. She'd been 19. Her father had still been handling some of the accounts himself. "My father must have authorized that payment before I took over full management. I didn't catch it." "Someone took $40 from your family and gave you nothing for it," Harrington said. "Do you know who Benjamin Hale is?" "A supplier, or he was. He sold the operation 3 years later. He sold it to Marcus Beale." The name hit her like cold water. Marcus Beale, their creditor, the man who held the note on the Whitmore farm mortgage. She stood very still. "How do you know that?" she asked. "Because Beale is Caldwell's business partner," Harrington said. He finally looked up at her. "And because I've been trying to trace his network of fraudulent accounts for 2 years. You just handed me a piece of it." The clock on the mantel ticked. Clara became aware that she had been leaning slightly against the edge of his desk, and she straightened up and took a step back, because her legs had gone slightly unsteady, and she didn't want him to see that. "He owns our mortgage," she said. "Yes. And he's connected to Caldwell. He's been connected to Caldwell since at least 1812. What your sister did, repeating that gossip, Caldwell will use it. He's already probably planning to. He'll use the reputational damage to depress the value of my land, then make an offer. If I'm legally entangled with your family at the same time, it compromises my ability to respond to him quickly." "Then we've made things worse," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "My sister made things worse for you." "Yes." She looked at him. "What do you need from us to fix it?" He looked back at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was shifting, coming through the west window now, and it fell across the desk between them and across the open ledger with its damning August entry. "I need the problem to look solved," he said. "Caldwell is watching this house. He has eyes in this county. If a Whitmore walks in and walks out and nothing changes, he'll know the complaint is still alive. He'll use it. So what changes it?" He was quiet. He had the look of a man who had already considered several answers to that question and was now deciding which one to say out loud. "A marriage," he said, "would change it." Clara heard the word. She stood perfectly still. "Your family is connected to Caldwell's network through Beale," Harrington continued, his voice level, as though he were discussing crop rotation. "If you and I are married, that connection changes. Legally, financially, publicly. Caldwell loses the angle he's been building. Your family's debt transfers to an estate that Beale cannot touch." And I have a witness to his fraudulent ledger work who has been managing accounts since she was 19 and knows this county's financial history better than anyone I've met." The clock ticked again. "You're serious," Clara said. "I don't make proposals as a joke." "You've known me for—" She turned to look at the clock. 40 minutes. "I've known of you longer than that." He folded his hands on the desk. "You have a reputation in the merchant quarter of Fredericksburg for being the sharpest account handler south of Richmond. I've heard your name 3 times in the past year from men who do business with your family. I didn't connect it to Josie Whitmore's gossip until you walked in here and started talking." Clara looked at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them looked away. "This would be a business arrangement," she said slowly. "To begin with. And my family. The mortgage transfers. Beale loses his leverage over you the day we sign the papers." She thought about her father, sitting in his chair by the window, his hands that had gone so thin. She thought about the August entry in the ledger. $40 vanished. A thread of fraud that ran all the way back to the man who now held the note on everything her family had built. She thought about Josephine at the kitchen table, not looking up. She thought about what her mother had said. "You're the only one who talks sense." She had walked 3 miles in July heat to beg a stranger not to ruin her family. She had not expected to walk out of here with his name. "I'll need a week," she said, "to speak to my father." "You have 3 days," he said. "Caldwell moves fast." She picked up her satchel from the floor. She smoothed her skirt. She looked at William Harrington across his desk, across the open ledger, across 40 minutes of conversation that had rearranged every plan she'd had for her life. 3 days, she said. She walked out of his study, back through the cool hallway, out the front door, and down the steps into the full summer heat. She walked the length of the oak-lined drive and through the iron gate and out onto the road before she stopped. She stood there in the sun for a long moment. Then she put one foot in front of the other and started the 10 miles home. She told her father first. Not her mother, not Josephine. Her father. He was sitting in the wingback chair by the window, wrapped in a quilt despite the July heat, his Bible open on his knee. He had been a minister once, a man with a voice that could fill a room. Now he looked like the room had gotten larger without him. Clara sat on the footstool in front of him and told him everything. The letter, the walk, the study, the August ledger entry, Beale and Caldwell. What Harrington had proposed. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked out the window for a long time. "Do you trust him?" he asked. "I don't know him," she said. "I trust that he was honest with me about why he's asking. That's something." "Is it enough?" She looked at her hands. "We don't have $40 to spare, Papa. And Beale holds the note. If Caldwell moves against Harrington, and Harrington is tied up defending himself, Beale can call in the note, and there's nothing we can do. This is the only door I see open." Her father was quiet for a long time. Outside, a mockingbird was singing from the oak tree, 3 notes repeated, patient and relentless. "You've been taking care of this family since you were 19 years old, he said finally. "I know that. I've known it, and I haven't said it often enough." Clara looked up. "I'm sorry for that," he said. "And I'm sorry you're in this room having this conversation." He closed the Bible on his knee. "But I won't make this decision for you, Clara. You're the only one who knows what you can live with." She nodded. She sat with that for a moment. Then she stood up, kissed her father on the forehead, and went to write the letter that would go back to Harrington Estate before morning. She had 3 days. She was going to use 2. The response came before noon of the second day. Not a letter, a writer. A young man in Harrington livery who handed her a sealed note at the front gate and waited while she read it. It said, "Thursday, 10 o'clock. Bring what you need. Leave what you don't." She read it twice. She folded it and put it in her dress pocket. She stood in the gate and looked at the road for a long moment, the summer heat pressing down on everything, the fields shimmering in the distance. Then she went inside to pack a trunk. She packed her gray dress and her church dress and the blue one she'd made herself from a bolt of fabric she'd bought 3 winters ago and never had occasion to wear. She packed her father's ledger, The original, not a copy. She packed her mother's Bible, because her mother had pressed it into her hands the night before, and Clara hadn't been able to say no. She packed her pen and her ink and 3 notebooks she'd been keeping accounts in since 1814. She did not pack her expectations. She had learned a long time ago that expectations were the thing most likely to be left behind anyway. On Thursday morning, she dressed in the gray dress, braided her hair, picked up the trunk that was not heavy enough to need a second person, and walked out of the house at dawn. Josephine was standing on the porch. Clara stopped. Her sister looked smaller than usual in the early light. Her arms crossed over her chest, her expression doing the thing it did when Josephine was sorry, but couldn't find a straight path to saying so. "Clara," she said. "Josie. You don't have to. I know. I didn't mean for any of this. I know that too." Clara looked at her. "But you need to stop repeating things Thomas Caldwell tells you. He's not your friend. He's not anyone's friend. Will you remember that?" Josephine was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. Clara shifted the handle of the trunk. She started down the porch steps. "Clara." Josephine's voice came after her, smaller now. "I'm sorry." Clara didn't turn around, but she said, clearly enough to be heard, "I know you are." And then she walked down the drive, out the gate, and up the road toward Harrington Estate, carrying everything she'd decided to bring and leaving everything she'd decided to leave behind. The morning was already warm. The mockingbird was singing again from somewhere in the trees. She walked. The rider who brought Clara's trunk to Harrington Estate was a quiet man named Amos, who said exactly 4 words during the entire trip. "Step up, miss," and "Here we are." And Clara respected him enormously for it. She had ridden in the back of the wagon with her trunk and her thoughts, watching the oak-lined drive approach, and by the time the wheels stopped, she had made herself a promise. She would not look small in this house. She would not apologize for taking up space. She had been apologizing for other people her entire life, and that season was finished. A woman met her at the door. Stout, sharp-eyed, somewhere past 60, wearing a gray apron and an expression that gave nothing away. She introduced herself as Mrs. Adler, the housekeeper, and she looked Clara over from bonnet to boot with the calm efficiency of someone checking inventory. "Mr. Harrington is in the north field until noon," she said. "I'll show you your rooms." Rooms, plural. Clara followed her up the stairs without comment. The rooms were at the east end of the second floor. A bedroom, a small sitting room adjacent to it, and a narrow door that opened into a study space barely big enough for a desk and a chair and a window that caught the morning light. Clara stood in the doorway of that last room for a moment longer than she stood anywhere else. "The desk was brought up this morning," Mrs. Adler said, from behind her. "Mr. Harrington said you'd want somewhere to work." Clara turned and looked at her. The older woman's expression had shifted. Not warmer exactly, but more considered. Like she was recalculating something. "Thank you," Clara said. "Dinner is at 6. He eats at the table, not in his study, and he expects the same of family." A beat. "The staff will take their cue from how you carry yourself. I'd advise you to carry yourself like you belong here." She left before Clara could respond. Clara stood in the little study and looked at the desk and the window and the morning light. "Like you belong here." She took off her bonnet. She set her satchel on the desk. She opened her notebooks and laid them in a row. Then she sat down and got to work. She had been at the desk for 2 hours when she heard boots on the stairs. Not tentative boots. Not the sound of a man checking on a guest. The sound of a man who lived in a house and moved through it without moderating his step for anyone. Clara had the financial summary she'd been drafting half-finished in front of her, and she didn't put it away. He appeared in the doorway of the small study. He'd been working. His coat was off, his sleeves rolled, and there was a line of dried mud along the side of one boot that he either hadn't noticed or hadn't cared about. He looked at her at the desk and at the notebook spread across it and at the ink on her right forefinger. And something in his expression settled, the way an account settles when the final column balances. "You work fast," he said. "I had time this morning." She set her pen down. "I've been going through what you showed me yesterday, the Beale connection." There are 3 more entries in our ledger I think connect to it. I want to walk you through them before I draw conclusions. He leaned against the doorframe. Now? You have something more urgent? He looked at her for a moment. Then he pushed off the frame and walked to the desk and pulled the second chair around from the corner and sat down. And Clara spread the ledger between them and began to talk. He listened the way he'd listened in the study the day before, without interrupting, without performing attention, with the kind of actual focus that Clara associated with people who had learned, somewhere along the way, that the cost of not listening was higher than the cost of their own opinions. She walked him through the 3 entries. August 1814, the $40 ghost payment. November 1815, a supply contract with a company she now believed was a Beale shell. March 1816, a land survey fee paid to a man named Josiah Pratt, who had also appeared as a witness signature on 2 of the Ridgeline Road sale documents she'd tracked from the county registry. By the time she finished, his forearms were on the desk, and he was leaning forward, looking at the March entry with the expression of a man who has just watched 2 puzzle pieces find each other. Pratt, he said. I know that name. He works for Caldwell now, or he did as of last year. He witnessed the deed on the Hollis farm sale. I remember because I thought it was strange. Pratt is a surveyor, not a legal witness. He witnesses whatever Caldwell needs him to witness. Clara sat back. They used our family as a staging point. The Whitmore account was small enough to go unnoticed. They ran payments through us, probably to create a paper trail that looked legitimate. My father never would have known. He trusted Benjamin Hale for 30 years. And you didn't catch it. It wasn't an accusation, but it landed like one, only because she'd already said it to herself 100 times. I didn't catch it, she said. I was 19. I'm catching it now. He held her gaze. You're right, he said. You are. She hadn't expected that. She looked back at the ledger. I want to draft a full accounting, she said, of every transaction I can trace back to Caldwell's network. If we can take it to the magistrate with documentation this thorough, it changes the nature of the complaint entirely. It's no longer Josephine's gossip, it's fraud. That'll take time. Give me a week. How was quiet for a moment? You've been here 3 hours. I work quickly when I'm angry, Clara said. Something changed in his expression. Not quite a smile. William Harrington did not appear to be a man who smiled easily, but something in the neighborhood of one. Then let's talk about what else you'll need, he said. The first dinner was strange, not uncomfortable, exactly. Clara had eaten at enough awkward tables in her life to know the difference between a silence that was hostile and a silence that was simply unfamiliar. William Harrington ate with focus and without ceremony, and he asked her 2 questions across the meal. What she'd observed about the northern field drainage, which she'd apparently looked at through the window long enough to form an opinion, and whether she preferred coffee or tea in the morning. She told him about the drainage. There was standing water she'd noticed at the field's lower edge that suggested a blocked channel, and she said coffee. He said, The blocked channel has been there 2 years. The man I hired to fix it went to work for Caldwell. Clara set down her fork. Deliberately? I believe so. That's not just land scheming, that's sabotage. Yes. She looked at him across the table. He was watching her with that level, patient attention, and she understood suddenly that he had been managing this alone, the full weight of Caldwell's operation pressing against his estate from every direction, and that he'd been doing it without anyone to think alongside. How long have you known? She asked. Suspected? 2 years. Known? About 6 months. And you haven't gone to the magistrate because Caldwell has 3 of the county magistrates in his pocket, Harrington said. I've been building a case clean enough to go over their heads. To Richmond. Federal level, if it needs to go that far. Clara absorbed this. That's why you needed the paper trail. Something that doesn't touch the local courts. Something that can't be quietly buried. She looked at her plate. She thought about her father's chair by the window. She thought about the August 1814 entry, $40, and all the years she'd spent managing accounts that were already being quietly hollowed out by men she'd never met. Then we build it right, she said. All of it, clean. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his fork. "Yes," he said. "We do." The second week was harder. Not because of the work. The work was the clearest thing Clara had experienced in years. A problem with edges she could trace, and evidence she could verify, and a shape that was slowly becoming visible, the way a map became visible when you added enough landmarks. That part she understood. The hard part was the house. Not Mrs. Adler, who had moved from suspicious to watchfully neutral with an efficiency that Clara appreciated. Not Amos, who said as few words to her as he said to everyone, and seemed to mean them all. Not the other staff. There were 7 of them, and they were cautious but not unkind. The hard part was the social machinery of Harrington County, which began to register her presence within 4 days of her arrival. The first visit came on a Wednesday. 3 women from the county's leading families, arriving in a carriage that cost more than the Whitmore farm's annual income, wearing expressions that had been carefully composed into the shape of friendliness. They were shown into the front parlor by Mrs. Adler, who came to find Clara in the small study with the message delivered in a voice that managed to communicate both the fact of the visit and a complete dossier of its likely intentions. Clara washed the ink off her fingers, put on the blue dress, and went downstairs. The women were Harriet Wentworth, Margaret Caldwell, who introduced herself as a cousin of Thomas Caldwell, which she did immediately and without apparent self-consciousness, and a young woman named Delia Morse, who seemed to have come along primarily to listen. They had brought a cake. "We wanted to welcome you, Mrs. Harrington," Harriet Wentworth said, with the bright, sharp warmth of a woman who had never said a careless word in her life. "It's been so long since this house had a mistress." "It's been very kind of people to call," Clara said. She poured the tea herself, because Mrs. Adler had taught her in 2 days exactly how Harrington household hospitality was meant to look, and Clara was a fast learner. "Please, sit." They sat. They sipped. Margaret Caldwell looked around the parlor with the expression of a woman cataloging a room. "We heard the wedding was very private," she said. "It was," Clara said. "No family in attendance? My father's health made travel difficult. Mr. Harrington preferred a small ceremony." Both of those things were true. The ceremony had been 8 minutes long, witnessed by Mrs. Adler and Amos, conducted by a minister who asked no unnecessary questions. Clara had worn the blue dress. William had worn his good coat. They had shaken hands afterward, which was not traditional, but which had felt more honest than the alternatives. "Of course," Margaret said, and smiled with every part of her face except her eyes. "And how are you settling in? It must be quite an adjustment. Coming from—" She paused, just long enough. "A smaller household." "I find I adjust quickly," Clara said. "I always have." Delia Morse was watching her with an expression that was harder to read than the others. Not hostile, not performing, just attentive. Clara filed that away. "My cousin Thomas speaks very highly of the Whitmore family," Margaret said. Clara set down her cup. She looked at Margaret Caldwell with the same expression she used when a ledger showed her a number that didn't add up. "How kind of him," she said. "Please give him my regards." After they left, Mrs. Adler appeared in the parlor doorway. "Margaret Caldwell has called on this house 4 times in the past year," she said. "Mr. Harrington has never been home." Clara looked at the untouched cake on the table. "He made himself unavailable. Every time." "She's his eyes in here," Clara said. "Caldwell sent her to see what we're doing." Mrs. Adler picked up the cake and looked at it. "Should I throw this out? Put it in the kitchen. I won't insult the cake for what the woman who brought it intended." Clara stood. "But yes. I think we assume everything Margaret Caldwell sees, Caldwell knows by the next morning." The older woman looked at her for a moment. "You figured that out quickly." "I recognize the pattern," Clara said. "I've watched men like Caldwell use women as messengers their whole lives. The women usually don't know they're doing it." She paused. "Margaret knows." Mrs. Adler set the cake down. "I believe you may be right," she said. It was not exactly approval, but it was the closest thing to it Clara had received since she walked into this house, and she felt it land in her chest with a weight she hadn't expected. She was still awake at 11 o'clock that night when she heard William's footsteps in the hallway. She'd learned his walk by now, the particular weight of it, slower after long days in the fields, and then a pause outside the study door. He knocked. "Come in," she said. He opened the door and looked at the desk and the candle and the papers spread across every inch of available surface. He looked at her. "You should sleep," he said. "I found something." He came in. She had been cross-referencing the county property records she'd borrowed from the clerk's office. William had arranged access against Caldwell's known land acquisitions, and she had found it 3 hours ago and spent 3 hours making sure she was right before she said it out loud. "There's a deed," she said. She turned the property record toward him. "Filed in December 1815, land on the western boundary of your estate, 40 acres of river access property. It's listed as sold to a holding company, Meridian Land Associates." "I know that sale," he said. "My father sold it. I was in Philadelphia." "Meridian Land Associates doesn't exist," Clara said. "It's not registered in Virginia. It's not registered in any state I can find. The deed was notarized by Josiah Pratt." I went very still. "Your father sold 40 acres of his own land," she said carefully, "to a company that doesn't legally exist, notarized by a man who works for the person who wants to take your estate. And the deed was filed 6 months before your father died." The candle between them burned without moving, the flame perfectly still in the airless room. "He was sick," William said. "The last year. His mind wasn't." He stopped. "They knew," Clara said quietly. "Caldwell knew your father was declining, and he moved before you came home." She let that sit. She didn't try to soften it, because it couldn't be softened, and she'd found that people who tried to carry hard truths easier only made them heavier. The truth was the truth. Caldwell had used his father's illness. That was what it was. William put one hand flat on the desk. He looked at the deed. "Can we challenge it?" he said. "I think so. A deed notarized by a man with no legal standing with a company that has no legal registration. There are grounds. But we need a lawyer who isn't connected to the county court." "Richmond," he said. "Richmond. And we need to move before Caldwell finds out we have this, because once he knows we've seen the deed, he'll do something to accelerate his timeline." She looked at him. "How fast can you get a rider to Richmond?" "Before dawn," he said. "Then send one." He straightened up. He looked at her for a moment, at the ink on her hands and the candle and the hours of work spread across the desk. And his expression was not the measuring, patient look he'd used in the first days. It was something else, something more personal. "You found this in 3 weeks," he said. "I had good records to work from. Clara." He said her name the way people said it when they meant more than the name. "I have paid 3 different solicitors in the past 2 years, and none of them found this." She looked up at him. "I looked in the right places," she said, "because you knew where to look, because I know how men like Caldwell think." She closed the property record. "They think no one is paying close enough attention. They think women especially aren't paying close enough attention. They're usually right." She met his eyes. "I'm not most women." He held her gaze for a long moment. Something moved across his face that she couldn't name. Not quite the almost smile she'd seen before, but something that started in the same place and went deeper. "No," he said. "You're not." He pushed off the desk. He walked to the door. He stopped in the frame. "Get some sleep after the rider goes," he said. "We'll need clear heads tomorrow." "I will." He nodded once. He left. Clara sat at the desk for another few minutes, listening to his footsteps move down the hall and down the stairs. Then she folded the property deed carefully, wrapped it in clean paper, and put it in the locked drawer at the bottom of the desk. She blew out the candle. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. Not because she was frightened, because for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt like she was in the right place doing the right thing. And that feeling was strange enough that her mind kept turning it over, examining it from every angle, trying to find the flaw in it. She didn't find one. The morning after the writer went to Richmond, Thomas Caldwell came to call. He didn't send a note ahead. He arrived at 9 o'clock in a carriage that stopped at the front gate, and he walked up the drive himself, which told Clara two things. He wanted to appear casual, and he wanted to see the house from the approach. She was watching from the study window, not hiding, just working. And she saw him before Mrs. Adler came to tell her. "I know," she said. "Send him to the front parlor. Tell Mr. Harrington." She took her time. She finished the sentence she was writing. She cleaned her pen. She walked to the small mirror in the bedroom and checked that her hair was pinned. Then she went downstairs. Caldwell was standing when she entered, which was technically correct. A man stood when a woman entered a room. But he was also standing in the way of a man who wanted to be seen as larger than the furniture around him. He was older than she'd expected, mid-50s, with the ruddy look of a man who ate and drank well, and had made peace with what that did to a face over time. He smiled when she came in, the kind of smile that was long practiced at appearing warm. "Mrs. Harrington," he said, "I hope I'm not calling at an inconvenient hour." "Not at all, Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Please sit." She sat first. He sat. "I've been meaning to call since I heard the happy news," he said. "The wedding rather caught us all by surprise. We weren't trying to create a spectacle." "No, of course not." He set his hat on his knee and turned at once. "Is Mr. Harrington about?" "He'll join us shortly." "Wonderful." Caldwell looked around the room. "This house hasn't looked this well in some years. A woman's touch makes all the difference." "I imagine competent management makes all the difference," Clara said pleasantly. "The touch is incidental." A beat. Caldwell recalibrated his smile. "Quite right. I've heard you're very capable. Your family's farm. You managed the accounts there?" "I did." "For many years?" "Since I was 19. "Remarkable." He tilted his head. "Difficult work for a woman alone." "Difficult work for anyone without the right training," she said. "I was fortunate to have good instincts and patient suppliers." She paused. "Though not all of them were patient, I suppose. Do you know a man named Benjamin Hale?" The turn was so small she almost missed it. Almost. A quarter-inch shift of his weight, a half-second's delay before the pleasantly blank expression resettled. "The name is familiar," he said. "A merchant?" "A supplier. He sold his operation some years ago. I've been going through old accounts, and I came across his name." She kept her voice light, her hands easy in her lap. "One of those loose ends you find when you take over someone else's books. I like to know where every dollar went." "Of course," Caldwell said. "Very thorough." The door opened and William came in. He shook Caldwell's hand with the controlled cordiality of a man who knew exactly who he was shaking hands with. He sat down beside Clara, not across the room, not at the far chair. Beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and the message of that positioning was not subtle. "Thomas," he said. "William. Congratulations are long overdue, I think." Caldwell spread his hands. "I've always thought this place needed more life in it." "It's doing well," William said. "The harvest looks strong. The accounts are in order." He glanced at Clara. "Better than order, actually." "I imagine so." Caldwell's eyes moved between them. "I wanted to discuss the western boundary property, actually. The river access parcel. I believe there may be a question about the deed status, and I thought it better to address it directly rather than—" "There's no question about it," William said. Caldwell blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The deed. There's no question about it. We've been in contact with Richmond about the matter. It's being handled." The briefest stillness. The pleasantly broad face doing its recalculations. "I see," Caldwell said. "I wasn't aware." "No," William said. "I don't imagine you were." The room held that for a moment. Clara kept her hands still, and her face neutral, and her breathing even. Caldwell stood. He picked up his hat. He smiled one more time, and this smile was different from the first, narrower, without any warmth beneath it at all. "Well," he said, "I'm glad things are in hand. My regards to your family, Mrs. Harrington." "And mine to yours, Mr. Caldwell," she said. He left. The front door closed. The carriage moved on the drive outside, and then it was quiet. William turned to look at her. "You said Hale's name to him," he said. "I wanted to see his face." "And?" "He knew the name," she said. "He pretended he almost didn't. That's worse than pretending he'd never heard it at all. It means he's not quite disciplined enough to fully hide it. He's used to not being challenged." She stood. "He's going to move faster now. He knows we're looking." "Then we need Richmond to move faster." "Write today," she said. "Not just the lawyer. Write to the land registry directly. We need the Meridian deed flagged before he can alter the filing." William was already on his feet. "I'll send another rider this afternoon." "Good." She started for the door. Then she stopped. She turned back. "He came here to find out how much we knew," she said. "Which means he's been wondering about it since the first rider went. Which means he has someone watching this house." William looked at her. "The woman who watches the laundry line," she said. "She lives at the property edge, the small gray house at the south field. She's out there regardless of weather, regardless of time of day. She's been there every day since I arrived." He was very still. "I'll take care of it," he said quietly. "Don't frighten her. She's probably being paid and doesn't know who she's working for. Just—" Clara thought about it. "Give her more money than Caldwell's paying her. And give her something to see that doesn't help him." He looked at her for a long moment. "You think of everything." "I think of what's in front of me," she said. "It just tends to be more than other people are looking at." She went back upstairs to the study. Outside, down the long oak drive, the dust of Caldwell's carriage was settling on the summer road. Clara picked up her pen, turned to a fresh page in her notebook, and wrote at the top of it, in the clear, careful hand she'd been using since she was old enough to hold a pen, "What we know, what we can prove, what comes next." Then she started writing. The letter from Richmond arrived on a Friday. Clara was at the desk when Mrs. Adler brought it up, and she knew from the weight of it, thick, folded twice, sealed with official wax, that it wasn't a simple acknowledgement. She broke the seal and read it standing, because sitting felt too passive for whatever this was going to be. It was worse than she'd expected, and better, both at once, which was the most dangerous kind of news. The Richmond Land Registry had confirmed what she'd found. The Meridian Land Associates deed was fraudulent. The company had never been legally registered in Virginia or any neighboring state. The notarization by Josiah Pratt was invalid. Pratt held no notarial commission in the Commonwealth of Virginia and never had. The 40-acre river access parcel, sold from the Harrington estate in December 1815, had been transferred through a document that had no legal standing whatsoever. That was the better part. The worst part was the second page. The registry clerk in Richmond had flagged the deed for review, which was the correct procedure. But the flag had been entered into the official record, which was a public record, which meant that anyone with access to the registry office, anyone at all, could see that the Harrington estate had filed a challenge to the Meridian deed. Clara read the second page twice. Then she folded the letter, walked downstairs, and went looking for William. She found him in the north field, which she'd learned by now was where he went when he was thinking through something difficult. She didn't slow down when she saw him. She walked the full length of the field path and handed him the letter without preamble. He read it. His jaw tightened on the second page. "He'll know by Monday," he said. "He probably already knows," she said. "If he has anyone in the registry office, and I'd bet my father's farm he does, he knew within an hour of the flag being entered. Then we've lost the element of surprise, on the deed challenge, but not on everything else." She took the letter back. "The deed being exposed isn't enough on its own to stop him. Even if we get the 40 acres restored, Caldwell still has Beale holding leverage over a dozen families in this county. He'll pivot, find another angle." She looked at William directly. "We need to go wider than the deed. We need to take the whole network to Richmond. All of it. The shell companies, the fraudulent surveys, the mortgage manipulation. Everything I've documented in the past month." He looked at her. "You have enough?" "Almost. I need 2 more things. I need a signature trace on the Meridian incorporation attempt. Someone tried to register that company, even if it failed, and that filing will be somewhere. And I need a witness. Someone inside Caldwell's operation who knows the structure of it." Witnesses don't come forward against Caldwell, William said flatly. 2 men tried. 1 left the county, 1 recanted. I'm not looking for a man, Clara said. I'm looking for Delia Morse. He went still. The girl who came with Margaret. She's not a girl. She's 24, and she's been Caldwell's unofficial bookkeeper for 3 years. She knows things Margaret Caldwell doesn't know, and she knows them because she's the one who wrote them down. Clara watched his face. She's also the one who came to call on me and spent the whole visit watching rather than talking, which is what a person does when they're trying to figure out whether someone is trustworthy before they make a decision. You got all of that from 1 visit. I got that from watching people for 26 years. She held his eyes. Let me talk to her. He was quiet for a moment. The summer wind moved through the field around them, and the heat was thick and full and relentless, the kind that made everything feel more urgent than it already was. If Caldwell finds out she's spoken to you, he started, then we make sure he doesn't find out until it doesn't matter anymore. Clara pressed the folded letter against her side. Trust me on this. He looked at her for a long moment. A long, particular moment. The kind that had been happening more often lately, where she felt the full weight of his attention, and it didn't feel like being assessed. It felt like being seen. All right, he said. She sent a note to Delia Morse through a channel that didn't touch anyone connected to either household. She gave it to Amos, who gave it to a free black man named Clem, who ran the dry goods supply on the North Road, who happened to make a delivery to the Morse family property twice weekly. It was Mrs. Adler who suggested this. Mrs. Adler, Clara was learning, knew every functional channel of information in Harrington County that the wealthy families didn't control, and she'd been quietly protecting William with that knowledge for years. The note said, I would like to discuss accounts. Not mine, yours. You know which ones. Name the place. The response came in 2 days. 1 line, in handwriting that was careful and even and trained. The handwriting of someone who'd been taught to make their letters look like they belonged to a ledger. The Millers Road. Tuesday. Noon. Tuesday at noon the heat was merciless. Clara walked the Millers Road from the north end. Delia Morse was already there when she arrived, standing in the shade of the tree line, wearing plain clothes that didn't match the carriage she'd arrived in. She'd walked too, Clara noted, which meant she hadn't told her family where she was going. They looked at each other for a moment. You figured it out at the parlor visit, Delia said. Not a question. Most of it. The rest I filled in after. Clara kept her voice level. How long have you been keeping his books? 3 years. I started when I was 21. He told my father it was respectable work. Accounting assistance for a business operation. Her jaw moved. That's what it was at first. Then it became something else. What did it become? Delia looked at her steadily. Shell company ledgers, land transfer documents, payroll for surveyors who surveyed nothing. I wrote the numbers down, and I didn't ask where they came from because I was 21 and my family needed the income, and I told myself I didn't know what it meant. She stopped. I know what it means now. Have you kept records of what you wrote? I keep everything. Her voice was quieter now, harder. I keep it because I knew someday someone would ask me to account for what I'd done, and I wanted to be able to say I hadn't hidden it. I don't know if that's smart or foolish. It's the right thing, Clara said. Whatever else it is. Delia looked at her. Something in her face shifted. Not relief, not yet, but the thing before relief. The moment when you stop wondering if you made the right choice to trust someone and start knowing. What do you need? Delia said. A signature trace on Meridian Land Associates. Someone filed an incorporation attempt that failed. I need to know whose name is on it. Josiah Pratt filed it, Delia said immediately. On Caldwell's instruction. I have a copy of the filing attempt in my records because Caldwell asked me to document all the company formations, and I did. The air between them was very still. Will you bring that document to Richmond? Clara asked. In person. As a witness. Delia's face changed again. This time it was something closer to fear, the real kind, the kind that lives in the chest. If Caldwell finds out, he will find out, Clara said honestly. Eventually. I won't lie to you about that. But at that point, the question won't be whether he's angry. The question will be whether he has the power to do anything about it. She held Delia's gaze. Help me take away his power first. Then it won't matter what he knows. Delia was quiet for a long time. Longer than felt comfortable. Clara waited, because she understood that this silence was not hesitation. It was the sound of someone adding up the full cost of a decision and deciding to pay it anyway. When? Delia said. As soon as I can arrange the Richmond appointment. 2 weeks, maybe less. 2 weeks. Delia looked at the road, then she looked back at Clara. Don't tell Mr. Harrington where I live. He won't come near you, that I can promise. Delia nodded once. She pulled her plain cloak around her despite the heat and walked back toward the far end of the Miller's Road, and Clara watched her go and felt the particular weight of what she'd just asked someone to carry. She walked back to the estate faster than she'd come. She told William that evening. He was quieter than she expected. She'd laid out the full conversation. Delia's confirmation of the Pratt filing, the records she'd been keeping, the plan for Richmond, and he'd listened without interrupting, which was normal. But when she finished, he didn't respond immediately, and that was less usual. She's been living with that for 3 years, he said finally. Yes. Alone. Yes. He turned the pen over in his hands the way he did when he was thinking. You could have pushed harder. You could have told her what it would cost her not to come forward. I could have, Clara said. But then she'd come to Richmond because she was frightened, not because she'd chosen to. And a frightened witness is a fragile one. She looked at him. She'll hold up in Richmond because she's decided she wants to. That's the only kind of witness worth having. He looked at her across the desk. Where did you learn to think like this? She almost said from managing accounts, because that was the simple answer, and it was true enough. But she looked at him and thought about the question he was actually asking, not where she'd learned the mechanics, but where she'd learned to understand people the way she did. And she gave him the real answer instead. My father used to say that figures are just people's decisions written in numbers. You want to understand the numbers, you have to understand why someone made the decision they made. She turned her pen in her own hand. I've been reading people through their accounts for 7 years. Ledgers don't lie the way faces do. They can hide things, but they can't fabricate. Every number has a reason. Find the reason, you find the person. William was looking at her in a way she was starting to recognize. The same way he'd looked at her the night she found the Meridian deed, and the morning she laid out the Beale network, and when she'd named the woman watching the laundry line. Like someone who had expected a door and found a window and was still adjusting to the light. My father would have liked you, he said. It was a quiet thing to say. Simple. But it landed differently than simple things usually did, and she felt it in a place she wasn't entirely prepared for. What was he like? She asked. He was quiet for a moment, and she thought he might deflect. He was a man who kept things organized in separate rooms, she'd noticed, who answered direct questions directly and let the rest remain closed. But he didn't deflect. He believed in this land the way some men believe in God, he said. Not as a possession, as a responsibility. He used to walk every field himself every spring, even after his knees went, just to know it was all right. He paused. When I came back from Philadelphia and found out what had happened to the western parcel, how Caldwell had moved while he was sick, I felt it like I'd failed him. Like I'd been away when he needed me and let something be taken from him that he'd spent his life building. You didn't know, Clara said. I should have come home sooner. You couldn't have known he'd be targeted. No. He set the pen down. But I should have been here. She let that sit. She didn't argue with it, because sometimes guilt wasn't irrational. Sometimes it was the shape grief took when it needed somewhere to go, and the right response to it wasn't contradiction. Then get it back, she said quietly. That's how you answer it. Not by staying guilty, by getting it back. He looked at her. Something moved through his expression that she didn't try to name. That's what we're doing, he said. Yes, she said. That's what we're doing. 4 days later, Caldwell made his move. It didn't come as a confrontation. It never did, with men like him. They didn't walk through doors. They moved through walls. The first sign was a piece in the Harrington County Gazette, a small notice on the third page, the kind that looked like gossip but was engineered with the precision of a legal document. Clara read it at breakfast. The notice said, in the careful, smiling language of a society column, that several prominent county families had expressed concern regarding the rapid and informal circumstances of the Harrington marriage. That questions had been raised, in the interest of public record, about the nature of the arrangement. That a source close to the family had confirmed that the union had been motivated primarily by financial considerations. That the new Mrs. Harrington, previously of modest circumstances, had come to the estate under circumstances that could generously be called irregular. It didn't say her family was bankrupt. It didn't say she'd walked there alone. It didn't say she'd been sent to beg. It didn't have to. It pointed at all of it and let the county fill in the rest. William put the paper down without speaking. Clara finished reading. She set her coffee cup in the saucer. "He's trying to destabilize the marriage publicly," she said. "If people believe the union is fraudulent, it weakens our legal standing on the deed challenge. A man defending a contested marriage and a contested property simultaneously looks unreliable." "He's been planning this since your visit," William said. "Since before. This kind of piece doesn't get placed in 2 days. He had this ready." She looked at the paper. "The source close to the family. That's Margaret. She came to report, not to welcome." "I should have refused her entry." "No, if you'd refused her, he'd have used that too. That the new Mrs. Harrington was keeping the husband isolated from his neighbors. This way at least we know what he saw." Clara straightened. "It doesn't matter what the county thinks right now. What matters is Richmond." "It matters to you," he said. She looked at him. He was watching her with that steady attention, and she understood that he wasn't asking about strategy. He was asking about her. She was quiet for a moment. "People have underestimated me my entire life," she said. "I'm used to the opinion of a room not matching the truth of what's in it. This isn't the first time someone has looked at me and decided they already know what I am." She met his eyes. "It won't be the last. I stopped letting it determine my direction a long time ago." He held her gaze. Then he said, "I don't underestimate you." She held very still. "I know," she said. The second move came 3 days after the Gazette piece. Marcus Beale called in the Whitmore mortgage. The letter arrived at the family home on a Wednesday, and Josephine wrote it to Harrington Estate herself. The first time she'd made the journey, and Clara felt the weight of that. The fact that it had taken a crisis to bring her sister to the door. Josephine handed her the letter and wouldn't quite meet her eyes. Clara read it. The terms were clear. The full outstanding debt of the Whitmore mortgage was due within 30 days, or the property would be seized by Beale's holding company. "He can do that?" Josephine said. "He can threaten it," Clara said. "Whether he can execute it is a different question." She looked at her sister. "Sit down, Josie." "Clara, if we lose the farm, sit down." Josephine sat. Clara went to find William. Howe was in the study, and he read the letter without her having to explain the context. He handed it back to her. "Beale is coordinating with Caldwell," he said. "This is the pressure move. They want us reacting to the mortgage instead of focusing on Richmond. If I spend the next 2 weeks managing a family financial crisis, I can't finish building the fraud case." She pressed the letter flat against the desk. "We need to pay the mortgage." "I'll arrange it." She looked at him. "The full amount," he said. "Today if possible. It removes the leverage, and it tells Caldwell his timing didn't work." "That's a significant sum," she said carefully. "It's a significant problem. One solves the other." He picked up his pen. "Write to Beale and tell him to expect payment within the week. I'll handle the bank." She didn't argue. She understood. She'd understood from the beginning that William Harrington's resources were the practical foundation of everything she was trying to build. What had shifted, in the weeks since she'd arrived with her trunk and her notebooks and her father's ledger, was that it no longer felt like a transaction. It felt like two people solving a problem that belonged to both of them. She wasn't entirely sure when that had changed. She was certain it had. She went in to see Josephine. Her sister was sitting in the front parlor, rigid with the particular tension of a woman who was preparing to be blamed for something and had decided to accept it preemptively. Clara sat across from her and said nothing for a moment. "He's paying it off," she said. Josephine looked up. "William is paying the mortgage, the full amount." The rigidity didn't leave Josephine's body. It shifted into something more complicated. "Clara," she started, "I didn't mean for any of—" "I know. I genuinely thought Caldwell was just being neighborly. I thought he was telling me something people didn't want to say out loud about Harrington because they were afraid of him." "Josie." Clara kept her voice quiet. "I know you didn't know. I know you made a mistake. What I need from you right now is not an explanation. I've had the explanation." She looked at her sister evenly. "What I need is for you to understand that Thomas Caldwell used your mouth to fire a shot he didn't want to fire himself. And I need you to understand it clearly enough that if he tries again, you'll recognize it before you speak." Josephine was quiet. "Do you understand it?" Clara said. "Yes," Josephine said, small and certain. "Yes, I understand it." Clara nodded. She stood. "Papa," she said. "How is he?" "Better this week. He asks about you every day." "Tell him I'll come soon." Clara. Josephine stood too. She was taller than Clara by an inch, had always been. And she looked at her now with the expression she'd had on the porch that morning 3 weeks ago. The expression that was sorry by way of something much larger. "You saved us. You didn't have to." "I had to," Clara said. "That's what I do." She picked up her satchel. "But I'd rather that be a choice than a habit. I'm working on the difference." She didn't explain that further. She walked out to where Amos was waiting to take Josephine home, and she went back upstairs to the study, and she opened her notebook to the page marked, "What we know, what we can prove, what comes next." She crossed out 3 items under the first column, moved them to the second, and added 2 new lines under the third. The case for Richmond was almost complete. That night, she couldn't find the energy to work past 9 o'clock, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. She sat at the desk for a while, looking at the papers without seeing them. Then she closed the notebooks, went down to the kitchen. The staff had gone to bed and the room was dark and warm, and stood at the work table eating a slice of bread and thinking about nothing in particular. She heard William on the stairs, then in the hall, then the kitchen doorway. He looked at her. She looked at him. He was in his shirt sleeves, which was not how he normally appeared outside his private rooms, and she understood from that he hadn't expected to find her there. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "Reading," he said. "The water channel report from the county engineer." He came to the table and cut himself a slice of bread from the same loaf. "You?" "Tired," she said. Which is different from being able to sleep. He leaned against the work table beside her, not across from her, not at a distance, beside her, and they were quiet for a while in the dark kitchen, with the bread and the thick summer night pressing against the windows. 2 weeks, she said. "To Richmond." 2 weeks, he agreed. "After that—" She stopped. She hadn't meant to say after that. She hadn't let herself think past Richmond because the whole weight of her concentration had been on building the case, and beyond that, there was territory she didn't have a map for. "After that," he said, not finishing it either, just carrying it alongside her. She looked at her bread. She looked at the dark window. She became aware that his arm was close to hers on the work table, close enough that she could feel the warmth of it. "I don't know what this is," she said. It came out plainly, the way honest things did when she was tired enough to stop managing them. "What we are. I know what we agreed to. I know why you asked. I know why I said yes. But I don't—" She stopped again. He was quiet for a moment. "I know what it was when I asked you," he said. His voice was low and steady in the dark kitchen. "I'm less certain what it is now." She looked at him. He looked back. The space between them was not large. "I need more time," she said. "I know," he said. And that was enough. That was the right answer. Not a push, not a retreat, Just the willingness to stand beside her in the dark kitchen with bread and an unfinished sentence between them, and not require it to resolve before it was ready. She finished her bread. She said goodnight. She went upstairs. She lay in the dark for a long time before she slept, and when she finally did, she did not dream about Richmond or Caldwell or the case or her father's farm. She dreamed about a man standing beside her on a summer road, watching the same horizon. It was not an unhappy dream. The morning she planned to finalize the Richmond documents, Margaret Caldwell came back. This time she came alone, and she came early, before 8 o'clock, which violated every convention of county calling hours. And she didn't accept Mrs. Adler's suggestion that she return at a more suitable time. She stood in the entrance hall and asked to see Mrs. Harrington, and she used a tone that didn't leave much room for the alternative. Clara was told. She came downstairs. Margaret was standing in the hall, and she did not look like the woman who had come with a cake and a smile. She looked like someone who had made a decision overnight and arrived before she could unmake it. "I need to speak with you privately," she said. Clara studied her face. "Come upstairs," she said. She took her not to the parlor, but to the small study. She made that choice deliberately because she wanted Margaret to see the work, the notebooks, the case that was nearly complete. She wanted her to understand, before she said whatever she'd come to say, exactly what she was stepping into. Margaret looked at the desk. She looked at the notebooks. She sat down without being invited, which was, Clara was realizing, a Harrington County habit. "Thomas knows about the Morse girl," she said. Clara kept her face still. "He knows she met with you," Margaret continued. "He doesn't know yet what she told you, but he'll find out. He finds out everything eventually." She pressed her hands flat on her knees. "He's planning to discredit her before she can testify. He has letters she wrote to a young man in Richmond, private letters, nothing improper, but the kind of thing that can be made to look improper if you have the right people reading them aloud in the right room." "How do you know this?" Clara said. Margaret looked at her with an expression that was past pretending. "Because he told me. He tells me things because he thinks I'm loyal to him. I have been loyal to him, for a long time." She stopped. "I'm tired of it." The silence in the small study was very complete. "Margaret," Clara said carefully, "if you tell me what you know, he will know it came from you." "Yes." "He won't forgive it." "No." "He'll move against you. Probably." Margaret's hands tightened on her knees. "I've thought about this every night for 2 weeks, Mrs. Harrington. Ever since you sat in that parlor and asked me about a supplier I'd never heard of in a voice that told me you—" She looked at Clara directly. "I have a letter he wrote to Beale in 1815, the original. It authorizes the Meridian scheme explicitly, in his own hand." Clara went completely still. "I've been keeping it for 3 years, Margaret said, because I knew what it was and I couldn't make myself burn it." Her voice was steady, the kind of steady that comes from deciding something so fully that there's no room left for trembling. "Tell me what you need me to do." Clara looked at the woman across from her, Margaret Caldwell, who had come into this house as an enemy's messenger and was now sitting in the small study with her hands flat on her knees, and an original document that could bring down Thomas Caldwell's entire operation in a Richmond courtroom. "I need that letter," Clara said. "I know. And I need you to come to Richmond." "I know that too." Clara leaned forward. "Can you get the letters he's planning to use against Delia before he moves?" "I can try." "Try today," Clara said. "Tonight if possible." Margaret Caldwell stood. She pulled her cloak around her. She looked at the notebooks on the desk one more time. "You're going to end him," she said. "Yes," Clara said. "Good," said Margaret. And she walked out of the study, down the stairs, and out of the house, and Clara watched through the window as she walked down the oak-lined drive and through the iron gate. Then Clara turned back to her desk. She picked up her pen. She wrote one word at the top of a fresh page. Richmond. Below it, she began writing the names, the documents, the testimony, the order in which it all needed to fall. The case was complete. They left for Richmond on a Tuesday. Clara had not slept the night before, not from fear, but from the particular electric wakefulness that came when every piece of something you'd been building was finally assembled, and you couldn't stop checking the joints. She'd gone through the case documents 4 times. She knew them the way she knew her own handwriting. She knew them better. William came to the study door at 5 in the morning and found her at the desk with the candle burned low and 3 notebooks open, and the Richmond letter from their lawyer, a man named Aldous Crane, recommended by a federal contact William had in Philadelphia, propped against the ink jar. He didn't say she should have slept. He looked at the desk and said, "Is it ready?" "It's ready," she said. "Then let's go." She closed the notebooks, wrapped the documents in oilskin, and put them in the leather satchel that had come with her from the Whitmore house. The same satchel she'd carried on the walk to Harrington Estate the first morning. She noticed that, and she held it for a moment, and then she picked it up and went downstairs. Delia Morse was waiting in the carriage. She had come at dawn with a satchel of her own, 3 years of records wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, carried under her arm, with the careful deliberateness of someone transporting something fragile and irreplaceable. She looked pale and steady, the way people looked when they were frightened, and had decided not to let it change their course. Margaret Caldwell was not in the carriage. She had sent a rider the night before with a message that said she would meet them at Crane's office at noon. She had the letter. She was coming. Clara believed her. William handed Clara into the carriage and climbed in after, and Amos clicked the horses forward, and they moved down the oak-lined drive and through the iron gate and out onto the road toward Richmond. Nobody spoke for the first mile. That was all right. There was nothing that needed to be said that hadn't already been said, and the silence between the 3 of them was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence of people who understood what they were going toward and had chosen to go anyway. Then Delia said, quietly, to no one in particular, "I've been afraid of this for 3 years." Clara looked at her. "Not of telling the truth," Delia said. "Of being in the same room with him when I do." "Caldwell won't be in the room when you testify," William said. Crane confirmed that. "The initial deposition is closed." "I know." Delia looked at her hands. "I'll be afraid anyway." "That's all right," Clara said. "Fear doesn't have to leave before you can act. It just has to not be the one driving." Delia looked at her. "You've been managing that yourself for a while now," Delia said. "Every day," Clara said, and she meant it. Aldous Crane's office was on the 2nd floor of a brick building 3 blocks from the Richmond courthouse, and the man himself was exactly what Clara had hoped for. Compact, dry, precise, with the manner of someone who had been practicing law long enough that he found drama inefficient. He shook William's hand, nodded to Clara, looked at Delia's package of documents with something approaching visible hunger, and set a pot of coffee on the desk before anyone asked. "Mrs. Harrington," he said, "I've read everything you sent. Before we begin, I want to tell you that what you've assembled here is the most comprehensively documented land fraud case I've received in 22 years of practice. If the witnesses hold, this goes to federal level. If it goes federal, Caldwell loses the county court protection he's been operating behind." He looked at her over his spectacles. "You did this in 6 weeks." "I had good source material," she said. "You had an instinct for where to look," he said. "That's rarer." William, beside her, said nothing, but she felt him not saying it. They spent 3 hours in Crane's office. Clara walked him through the document trail, the ghost payments, the Meridian deed, the shell companies, the Pratt notarizations, the Beale mortgage manipulation, and Delia laid out her records one by one on the table, in the order she'd been keeping them, and Crane read each one with the focused quiet of a man reading a map. At one point, he looked up from the Meridian incorporation attempt, the one bearing Josiah Pratt's name as filer, and said, "This is criminal fraud, Miss Morse. You understand that you are not implicated in this document." "I wrote numbers in a ledger," Delia said. "I didn't forge anything." "No. The numbers you recorded are evidence, not crime. Caldwell will attempt to argue coercion in your case regardless, that you were acting under his instruction and therefore bear responsibility. A federal court will not accept that argument given the documentation you've brought. But I want you to hear it plainly. You are a witness here, not a defendant." Delia pressed her lips together. She nodded once. At 11:30, there was a knock at the office door. Crane opened it. Margaret Caldwell stood in the doorway. She had dressed carefully for it, not in the elaborate carriage clothes she wore to social calls, but in a plain dark dress with her hair back. The look of a woman who wanted to be taken seriously. She was carrying a small rectangular package wrapped in cloth. She came in. She looked at Delia, and something passed between them. The look of two women who had both been in the same man's orbit and understood what that meant without needing to say it. She put the package on Crane's desk. "Thomas Caldwell's letter to Marcus Beale," she said. "Dated March the 4th, 1815. It authorizes the Meridian scheme by name, identifies Josiah Pratt as the notarial instrument, and instructs Beale on the mortgage structure for 6 Harrington County properties." She looked at Crane. "In his own hand. I watched him write it." Crane unwrapped the cloth. He read the letter without changing his expression. Then he set it down with the careful deliberateness of a man who had just handled something significant. "This," he said, "is the center of the case." "I know," Margaret said. "I've known it for 3 years." "Why now?" Crane asked. Not unkindly, professionally. Margaret looked at Clara. "Because someone finally walked into the room who was paying the right kind of attention," she said. The deposition was scheduled for the following morning. That night, Crane arranged rooms for all of them at a boarding house 2 streets away. One for William and Clara, one for Delia, one for Margaret. Clara sat at the small desk in the room after William went to sleep, and she went through the document order one final time. Not because she'd missed anything, but because the act of it settled something in her. She thought about Delia in the carriage, saying she'd been afraid for 3 years. She thought about Margaret walking through Crane's door with 3 years of a kept secret wrapped in cloth. She thought about what it cost a person to know something and carry it alone and wait for a door to open. She had been doing a version of that herself since she was 19. Managing the weight of her family's survival in silence, making decisions nobody recognized, being the one who knew where every dollar went because nobody else was watching. She hadn't thought of it as suffering. She'd thought of it as what needed to be done. But sitting in the small room in Richmond, with the case documents under her hand and the morning hearing 10 hours away, she thought, this ends here. Not just Caldwell. The habit of invisible labor. The assumption that Clara Whitmore was the one who carried things and nobody needed to say thank you. She thought about what William had said in the study that night. "My father would have liked you." She thought about the kitchen in the dark. "I'm less certain what it is now." She thought about the 30 days she'd spent in his house, sitting beside him over ledgers and evidence and hard truths. The way he'd watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, the way he listened. Not the performance of listening, but the actual thing. She closed the notebook. She went to bed. She slept 4 hours, which was enough. The deposition room was on the ground floor of a federal building on Broad Street. Crane had arranged for a federal land commissioner and 2 legal witnesses to be present. The room was plain, functional, deliberately without drama. Caldwell was not there. He would not be notified until after the deposition was entered into the federal record, at which point he would have 48 hours to respond through counsel. Crane had explained this to Clara twice. She understood the procedure. She also understood that a man like Caldwell had people watching the federal building the way he had people watching Harrington Estate, and that he would know within hours rather than days. She was prepared for that. Delia testified first. She was in the room for 40 minutes. Clara sat outside in the corridor with William, and neither of them spoke much. When the door opened and Delia came out, she was pale and her hands were clenched at her sides, but her chin was level. "It's done," Delia said. "How did it go?" Clara asked. "I answered every question they asked, and I didn't look away from any of them." Delia unclenched her hands deliberately, like releasing something. It went the way it needed to. Margaret went in next. She was in the room for 55 minutes. When she came out, she looked older than she had that morning. The way people looked after they'd put down something they'd been carrying so long, they'd forgotten it had weight. She sat in the corridor chair and pressed her fingers against her eyes for a moment. "He's going to be furious," she said. "He's going to be finished," Clara said. Margaret looked at her. Both, she said. Both things are true. Then it was Clara's turn. She walked into the deposition room with the leather satchel, and she laid the documents on the table in the order she'd practiced, and she talked for 68 minutes without notes, because she didn't need them. She knew every entry, every date, every transaction, every connection. She had been building this case for 6 weeks, and she knew it the way she knew her own ledgers, completely, without gaps, without hesitation. The federal commissioner asked her questions she'd anticipated, and 2 she hadn't. She answered all 4. When it was finished, he looked at the document stack and said, "Mrs. Harrington, this documentation establishes federal jurisdiction over the Caldwell-Beale operation. I'll be issuing a formal inquiry today. I expect Caldwell's counsel will attempt to delay through the county courts. They will not succeed." He looked at her over his papers. "You should know, this is not a common outcome. Most cases of this kind die in the county record because they can't be built past the local corruption. You built past it." "I had help," she said. "You led it," he said. She picked up the satchel. She walked out of the room. William was standing in the corridor. He looked at her face, and he knew before she said anything. "It's done?" he said. "It's entered," she said. "The inquiry is being issued today. Caldwell will know by nightfall." He let out a breath, slow and controlled, the breath of a man releasing something he'd been holding for a long time. 2 years of it, she knew. 2 years of watching Caldwell work against everything his father had built, of knowing what was happening and not being able to stop it cleanly. "The western parcel," he said. "The deed is invalid on record. Crane will file the restoration with the land registry this afternoon. It'll take some time to process formally, but it can't be challenged, not anymore." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you." She looked at him. "Don't," she said. "It wasn't a favor." "I know." He held her eyes. "That's why I'm thanking you." She looked at him standing in the corridor of a federal building in Richmond, with the summer light coming through the high windows and the weight of the past 2 years lifting visibly from the line of his shoulders, and she thought, "This is what I came for, not the transaction. This." She said, "Let's go home." They were an hour outside Richmond when the rider caught up to them. Amos pulled the horses up and the rider came alongside. A young man on a black horse, breathing hard, with a sealed note in his hand, addressed to William Harrington. William broke the seal and read it. His expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened in a way Clara had learned to read. He handed it to her. It was from Caldwell's attorney, not Caldwell himself, which was already interesting. It said, in the stiff formal language of a man writing under pressure, that Mr. Thomas Caldwell denied all allegations, that the federal inquiry was being contested as jurisdictionally improper, and that Mr. Caldwell reserved the right to pursue legal remedy for damages incurred through the dissemination of false documentation. And then, at the bottom, a single line that was not in the attorney's formal register. "Tell your wife that what she started cannot be finished without consequences she hasn't considered." Clara read it twice. She folded it. She handed it back to William. "He's threatening you," William said. His voice was level, but something beneath it was not. "He's threatening us," she said, "which means he's scared. Scared men threaten because they've run out of moves." She looked at the road ahead. "He can contest jurisdiction. His attorneys will argue that a federal land commissioner overstepped. They'll slow the process." "How much?" "Weeks. Maybe a month or 2, not more. Crane's filing is clean." She looked at him. "He knows the case is solid. This is noise, not strategy." "The last line isn't noise," William said. She looked at him. He was watching her with the particular attention he used when he was worried and trying not to show it in a way that would feel like underestimating her. "No," she said. "The last line is personal. He's telling me he knows I built this case and he wants me to be afraid." She held William's eyes. "I'm not afraid of him." "I know you're not," William said. "I am. On your behalf." She was quiet for a moment. "That's new?" she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." The carriage moved forward. Outside, the summer road stretched toward home. The consequences came, as threatened, and they came faster than Clara had estimated. The day after they returned, a legal notice was posted in the Harrington County Gazette, paid placement, in the official notices section, stating that the federal inquiry into Caldwell's land holdings had been contested and was under review by the state attorney general's office. It was technically true, in the way that a dressed wound is technically a wound. The contest had been filed, but Crane had already advised Clara that it had no reasonable chance of success. The state attorney general's office had been copied on the original federal deposition and had expressed interest in the matter themselves. But county people read county papers, and county papers printed what was paid to be printed, and what the notice accomplished, what it was designed to accomplish, was another 2 weeks of social uncertainty in Harrington County. Another 2 weeks of people at church and at market and at dinner tables asking each other what was true and landing on whatever version was most comfortable. The version that spread fastest, because it always did, was the simplest one. The Harrington marriage was at the center of a legal dispute. The new Mrs. Harrington had come from a family with debts and connections to the very fraud she was alleging, and who really knew where the truth lay. Clara knew who was seeding it. She'd known before she read it. Caldwell had always understood that in the absence of facts, people fill silence with suspicion, and he was very good at creating the right kind of silence. She let it go for 3 days. She went to church on Sunday and sat beside William in the front pew they'd shared since she arrived, and she nodded to the people who nodded to her and didn't look away from the ones who didn't. She attended the Tuesday market with Mrs. Adler and bought flour and thread and spoke to the dry goods man and the blacksmith's wife and 2 women she'd been introduced to at the June assembly who had been warm before the Gazette piece and were careful now. She let it all land on her, and she did not react to any of it, because she understood. She had always understood that how a woman responded to being talked about told people more than the talk itself did. On Wednesday morning, she went to see Harriet Wentworth. Harriet Wentworth was the most socially powerful woman in Harrington County who was not connected to Caldwell's network, and she was powerful in the particular way of women who had been alive long enough and sharp enough to be trusted with things other people didn't say out loud. She was 60, a widow, and she had known William's father for 30 years. Clara arrived at 9 o'clock with no appointment and no cake. The housekeeper showed her in with an expression that said this was irregular. Harriet Wentworth, in her sitting room with her coffee and her correspondence, looked at Clara over her spectacles with the expression of a woman who found irregular things interesting. "Mrs. Harrington," she said, "sit down." Clara sat. "You're here to manage the social situation," Harriet said. "I'm here to tell you the truth," Clara said, "so that you have it, and so you can do with it whatever you think is right." Harriet set down her coffee. "Go on," Clara told her. Not everything. She kept Delia's name out of it, and Margaret's, because they had taken enough risk and she would not add to it. But she told Harriet the structure of what Caldwell had built, the Meridian Deed, the Beale Mortgage Network, the way he'd been using women as information conduits, the federal inquiry, and why it would hold. She told it plainly, without embellishment, in the same voice she used when she was walking a lawyer through a ledger. Harriet listened the way William listened, not performing, not preparing her response while Clara was talking, but actually taking it in. When Clara finished, Harriet was quiet for a moment. "The Hollis family," she said. "They sold their Ridgeline Road property 2 years ago, moved to Tennessee. Thomas Caldwell was very helpful to them in the transition." "He drove them out," Clara said. "Then helped them leave." Harriet looked at her steadily. "And the Mercer farm. Same structure. Beale held the mortgage. Caldwell manufactured the pressure." Harriet turned her coffee cup in its saucer once, a small, slow circle. She was not looking at Clara. She was looking at something further back, some recalibration of things she thought she'd known. "I liked Thomas Caldwell," she said. "For 20 years, I thought he was a good neighbor." "He was a very good neighbor," Clara said. "That's what made him effective." Harriet looked back at her. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing that isn't yours to give," Clara said. "I need people in this county to understand that the legal process underway is legitimate. I can't control what people believe. But I've found that people believe things more readily when they hear them from someone they trust. You want me to talk. I want you to know the truth. What you do with it is your decision. Harriet studied her for a long moment. You walked here, she said. I watched you come up the drive. No carriage, no maid. I prefer to walk. You walked to William Harrington's house the first day too. People talk about that. They think it means something unfortunate about your circumstances. My circumstances were what they were, Clara said. I'd walk it again. Harriet was quiet for another moment. Then she straightened in her chair. Come to dinner on Friday, she said. I'm having 8 people. You and William both. And I'll seat you at the right end of the table. Clara understood what that meant. In Harrington County, social standing was partly a matter of geography at Harriet Wentworth's table. The right end was not a small thing. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Harriet said. Come back next Tuesday and tell me how the Gazette reports the federal inquiry outcome. She came home to find a letter that hadn't come through Crane. It was addressed to her, not William, in a hand she didn't recognize, with a Richmond postmark. She opened it at the desk. It was from Josiah Pratt. 3 paragraphs. The handwriting was uneven, the kind that happened when a hand was shaking, but the person had decided to write anyway. Pratt said he had heard the federal inquiry had been filed. He said he had not filed the Meridian incorporation attempt voluntarily. He'd been told it was routine paperwork for an existing company and had not understood what he was signing. He said he had documents that demonstrated the instruction came from Caldwell directly. He said he wanted to talk to someone who was not Caldwell's lawyer or Caldwell's friend. He said he'd heard Mrs. William Harrington was someone who was neither. Clara read it 3 times. Then she walked downstairs and found William in the study and put the letter on his desk without a word. He read it. He looked up at her. Pratt is turning, he said. He's scared, she said. He knows the federal inquiry is going to reach him. His name is on the Meridian filing. He can either be a defendant or a witness. He's working out which position protects him better. I was complicit. He was used, she said. Like Josephine, like Delia, like Margaret, for years. Caldwell is very good at finding people who need something and using what they need to get what he wants. She sat down across from him. Pratt's testimony, if he'll give it fully and under oath, confirms the chain of instruction from Caldwell. It removes any argument that the scheme was Pratt acting independently. It closes the last gap, William said. It closes the last gap. He looked at the letter, then at her. You want to bring him in? I want Crane to bring him in. I want everything done through Crane and the federal process, cleanly, with no exposure for us. She held his eyes. But yes, I think we should. William nodded slowly. I'll write to Crane today. Write tonight, she said. We've been a step ahead of Caldwell because we've moved faster than he expected. Let's keep moving. He picked up his pen without argument. She sat across from him while he wrote, and she opened her notebook and updated the document log, which was what she did every time something new came in, adding it to the record, making sure nothing existed only in memory. The room was quiet, and the candle was steady, and outside the summer was beginning to turn, just the faintest edge of something cooler in the evening air. After a while, William looked up from his letter. Clara, he said. She looked up. Friday dinner at Harriet Wentworth's, he said. You arranged that. She invited us. Because you went to see her. He held her gaze. You didn't tell me you were going. I didn't know if it would work, she said. I didn't want to raise an expectation I might not meet. He was quiet for a moment. You don't have to manage what you tell me. I'm not someone you have to protect from outcomes. She looked at him. The statement was simple, and it meant more than it said, and she thought he knew that. I know, she said. I'm still learning what this is. So am I, he said. They held that between them for a moment. Then he went back to the letter, and she went back to the notebook, and the candle burned between them, and outside the first edge of September touched the Virginia summer like a quiet hand. The dinner at Harriet Wentworth's was the turn. Not in the legal case, That had already turned, in a federal deposition room in Richmond, in Aldous Crane's steady hands. But in the social fabric of Harrington County, which was its own kind of law, slower and less formal, but in its way just as binding, Clara wore the blue dress. William wore his good coat, and he offered her his arm at the door, which he had not done before in public, and she took it, which she had not done before either. The 8 people at Harriet's table were the 8 people whose opinion moved in concentric rings through the county, and Harriet had seated them exactly where she'd promised. Harriet opened the dinner with a toast. "To honesty," she said, looking at nobody in particular and everybody at once, "which is always more expensive than it looks and always worth more than it costs." Clara lifted her glass. Across the table, a man named Judge Samuel Aldridge, retired, 70 years old, with the face of someone who had heard many things and decided to believe the ones that had evidence behind them, looked at her with the quiet, assessing attention she recognized. "Mrs. Harrington," he said, "I understand you have something of a background in land accounting." "In account management generally," she said. "Land is a particular interest." "I imagine it is," he said. "I spent 30 years on the county bench. I found that most fraud cases came down to 2 things: someone who understood numbers and someone willing to look at them honestly. It's a rarer combination than it should be." "It requires patience," she said. "It requires courage," he said. "The patience is the easier part." He raised his glass to her, a small and deliberate gesture, and Clara held his eyes and nodded once, and she felt something settle in the room that had been unsettled for weeks. By the end of dinner, 3 of the 8 people at the table had spoken to her at length, and none of them had spoken the way people spoke when they were managing discomfort. They spoke the way people spoke when they had decided something and were at ease with the decision. Harriet walked them to the door herself. "Tuesday," she said to Clara. "Come tell me what the Gazette says." "I will," Clara said. On the drive home, William sat beside her in the dark carriage and said, without preamble, "You turned it tonight." "Harriet turned it. I just gave her the truth to work with." "Clara." He said her name the way he'd been saying it lately, like it meant what it said, and also something more than that. "Stop deflecting credit." She was quiet for a moment. "It's a habit," she said. "I know." He looked at her in the dark. "Break it." She looked back at him. "I turned it tonight," she said. "Yes," he said. "You did." The carriage moved through the summer dark toward Harrington Estate, and the road was long and quiet, and she did not mind the silence because it was the kind that held something, rather than the kind that waited for something, and she had learned, slowly, to tell the difference. The Gazette ran the federal inquiry outcome on a Thursday. Clara read it at the breakfast table before William came down, and she read it twice, and then she set it flat on the table beside his coffee cup and waited. He came in, looked at her face, looked at the paper, and picked it up. The headline was restrained by the Gazette's usual standards. Federal Land Commission confirms inquiry into county holdings. But the 3 paragraphs beneath it were not restrained at all. They named Caldwell. They named Beale. They named Meridian Land Associates and its fraudulent registration. They named Josiah Pratt and his invalid notarial commission. They said the inquiry had been entered into the federal record and that the state attorney general's office had opened a parallel investigation. They did not name Clara. They named William once as the initiating complainant. She had expected that. She had filed everything through Crane in William's name because that was how things worked in 1817, and she had not wasted energy being angry about it. What mattered was that it was filed. What mattered was that it held. William set the paper down. "It's done," he said. "It's begun," she said. "The legal process takes time. But yes, the part that could be stopped has passed." He looked at her across the breakfast table. The morning light was coming through the east window, and it fell across the table between them. The paper, the coffee cups, the small ordinary geography of a shared morning. And he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her with increasing frequency, the way that had stopped feeling like assessment weeks ago and had started feeling like something she didn't have a word for yet, but was learning the shape of. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "When you walked into my study in July," he said, "I knew who you were. I'd heard your name from 3 different men in the merchant quarter. I knew you were the one running the Whitmore accounts. I knew your father was ill. I knew the family was in trouble." He paused. "What I didn't know was whether you'd be able to do what I needed. I was prepared to make the proposal regardless. It was strategic." "I know," she said. "I'm telling you it was strategic because I want you to know that what it became was not." He held her eyes. "It became something I didn't plan for, and didn't expect, and couldn't have manufactured if I'd tried. And I want to say that plainly, because you have spent 6 months in this house doing things that nobody thanked you for, and you did them anyway, and I think you deserve plain speech." She sat with that. "I'm not good at receiving it," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not good at giving it. We're even." She looked at the newspaper on the table. She looked at her coffee. She looked at William Harrington sitting across from her with his sleeves already rolled because he'd been to the Northfield at first light and come back in to breakfast, with the mud still on his boot. The same boot she'd noticed the first day he'd appeared in the study doorway. "I didn't plan for it either," she said. He nodded once, like a man who had just had a ledger balance. Mrs. Adler came in with the bread and did not comment on the silence, and did not need to, because she had been watching this particular development for 6 weeks with the patient attention of a woman who had been hoping for it longer than that. The first visitor arrived before noon. Not Caldwell. Caldwell was in Richmond. Clara had it on reliable report through Crane, meeting with his attorneys and discovering the extent to which the federal filing had sealed off his usual routes of appeal. But Robert Vance, who owned the farm directly east of the Harrington property, and who had been carefully neutral for the entire summer, appeared at the front gate on horseback and asked to speak to William. He came inside and shook William's hand and said, without any preamble, "I want you to know that I never believed the talk about your wife." William said, "I appreciate that, Robert." Vance looked at Clara, who was standing in the hall. "Ma'am, I've heard what you did in Richmond. The whole county's heard it by now." He turned his hat in his hands. "I had a transaction with Beale in 1814 that never sat right with me. A boundary survey that came back different than I expected. I'd like to show it to someone who knows what they're looking at." Clara looked at him for a moment. "Bring it tomorrow morning," she said. "I'll look at it." He nodded. He left. Mrs. Adler, from the kitchen doorway, said nothing, but her expression said something. Clara caught it and filed it away. By Friday afternoon, 3 more families had sent notes. One had a boundary dispute. One had a mortgage arrangement with Beale's holding company they wanted reviewed. One had a deed that didn't match their property map and had been told for 2 years that the discrepancy was a clerical error. Clara looked at the 4 notes on the desk and felt the particular sensation of a problem that was larger than she'd mapped. William came in and looked at the notes and looked at her. "It's bigger than Caldwell's operation against us," she said. "He's been running variations of this across the entire county. Different targets, different methods, same structure." "For how long?" "Long enough that I'm going to need more notebooks." She looked at him. "I need to write to Crane. This isn't just our case anymore. It's a county-wide fraud, and every family that was touched is going to need their documents reviewed." "That's months of work," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You're going to do it anyway." It wasn't a question. It was the statement of a man who had been watching her long enough to know the answer before he asked. "Someone has to," she said. He crossed to the desk. He pulled the second chair around the way he'd done the first morning she'd been in the study, and he sat down beside her and said, "Then let's figure out the order of it." She looked at him. "I know how to read a land deed," he said. "I've been managing this estate since I was 22. 2 of us will go through it faster than one." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she picked up the first note and handed it to him and said, "Vance, Boundary Survey, 1814. Tell me what you see." He looked at it. He turned it over. He set it flat and said, "The surveyor's mark on the eastern boundary is different from the one on the western. Different hand. Which means someone replaced the eastern marker after the original survey." She looked at the note. He was right. She had seen it too, but she'd been waiting to see if he would. "You'd have made a decent account manager," she said. "You'd have made a formidable estate owner," he said, without looking up from the note. She looked at the side of his face, and at the note in his hands, and at the morning light moving across the desk between them. And she felt something settle in her chest that she recognized now, that she'd been recognizing for weeks and had been honest enough with herself to name in private, but hadn't said out loud yet because she was learning, slowly, carefully, with the same patience she brought to a difficult ledger, to trust the thing that was being built between them. She didn't say it then, but she held it. Josiah Pratt came to Harrington Estate on a Saturday morning, which Clara had not expected. She had expected a letter, or a message through Crane, or perhaps a deposition filed quietly in Richmond without any face-to-face reckoning. What she had not expected was Pratt himself, a thin man, younger than she'd imagined, with the hollow look of someone who had not been sleeping, standing at the front gate asking for Mrs. Harrington. She went down herself, because she was the one he'd written to, and she respected the directness of showing up. He took his hat off when he saw her. He held it with both hands. "I came to tell you in person what I wrote in the letter," he said, "because I thought I owed you that much. I knew what I was signing. I told myself I didn't, but I knew." His voice was steady but thin, like a string pulled too tight. "I needed the work. Caldwell paid well. I told myself it was just paperwork." "It wasn't just paperwork," she said. "No." He looked at the ground for a moment, then back at her. "I have everything. Every document he gave me to sign. Every instruction he wrote out. I kept copies because I'm a careful man, and careful men keep copies." A pause. "It wasn't courage. It was habit. But it turns out to be the same thing in the end." "Will you take it to Crane?" she said. "I already sent it. Rode to Richmond this week." He pressed the hat brim in his hands. "I want you to know I understand that what I did hurt people. The Harrington estate. The families on Ridgeline Road. I don't expect forgiveness for that. I'm just—" He stopped. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had rehearsed what he wanted to say, and found, at the moment of saying it, that the words were harder than they'd been in practice. "I wanted to look at the person I helped harm and say it to their face. It seemed like the least I could do." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "It's not the least," she said. "It's more than most men do." He nodded. He put his hat back on. He walked back down the drive. She stood at the gate and watched him go, and she thought about what she'd said. It's more than most men do. And she thought about all the people in this story who had been given a choice between what was comfortable and what was right, and how many of them had taken years to get to the harder one. Delia, Margaret, Pratt, her sister, in her smaller way. Even herself. She had spent 7 years carrying her family's survival in silence, because it was easier than asking anyone to look at her honestly. She walked back to the house. She went upstairs to the study, and she picked up the notebook, the one that had started with what we know, what we can prove, what comes next. And she turned to a new page, and she sat with her pen for a moment without writing anything. Then she wrote, "What we built." She started a new list. The twist came on a Tuesday, 10 days after the Gazette piece, 8 days after Vance's visit, 6 days after Pratt had stood at her gate with his hat in his hands. It came in the form of a second letter from Crane, and this one was not the measured professional communication she'd come to expect from him. It was 3 pages, written quickly. She could tell from the pen pressure. And it began, "Mrs. Harrington, I write with information that materially changes the scope of what we are facing." She read it standing again, because that was what she did with bad news, and it was both bad and not bad in the particular way that things were when they were larger than you'd planned. Caldwell had made a move through the state attorney general's office, not to contest the federal inquiry, which he couldn't, but to argue that the inquiry was incomplete. He had submitted, through his attorneys, a counterfiling that included documentation of his own, a set of contracts, signed and dated, which purported to show that the Meridian deed transfer had been conducted with full knowledge and consent of a Harrington family representative. Not William. The contracts named his father. Not a forged signature. That would have been easy to disprove. The signature was real. Thomas Harrington Sr. had signed 3 documents in 1815 that, read in Caldwell's framing, suggested he had knowingly participated in the Meridian transfer. Crane's letter was careful and precise. The documents do not prove what Caldwell claims, but they create a cloud on the original deed challenge that requires direct rebuttal. We need to demonstrate that Thomas Harrington Sr. was operating under diminished capacity at the time of signing, and that Caldwell exploited that condition. This requires medical testimony or witness testimony about his mental state in 1815. I need this from someone who was present. Clara put the letter down. She picked it up and read it again. Then she went to find William. She found him in the north field, where she always found him when he was thinking. She walked the path without slowing, and she handed him the letter, and she stood beside him while he read it. She watched his face. She watched the moment the words landed, the moment he understood what Caldwell had done, what he'd been holding in reserve, the particular cruelty of using a dead man's signature against his son. William's jaw set hard. He finished reading. He held the letter for a moment without speaking. "He knew my father was declining in 1815, he said. His voice was quiet and controlled, and under it something that was not quiet at all. He targeted him deliberately, got him to sign things he didn't understand. Yes. My father was a careful man. He wouldn't have signed something like this if he'd understood what it was. Caldwell would have presented it differently, as routine, as paperwork." She watched him. "Who was with your father in 1815, when you were in Philadelphia?" He was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Adler," he said. "She was with him every day that last year." Clara was already turning back toward the house. Mrs. Adler was in the kitchen, and she listened to Clara's summary of the letter without interrupting and without changing her expression. And when Clara finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I watched him sign those papers." Clara went very still. "3 of them," Mrs. Adler said. "September 1815. Caldwell came himself with 2 other men, your father." She looked at William, who had followed Clara in. He was not well that day. He'd had 2 bad weeks. He knew who Caldwell was, but he was confused about the nature of the documents. He asked me twice what he was signing. Caldwell told him it was a land management agreement. Routine. Her voice was level, and her hands were flat on the work table, and underneath the levelness was something that had been sitting there for 2 years, waiting to be spoken. "I should have stopped it. I didn't know what it was. I thought Caldwell was a neighbor doing a courtesy." "You couldn't have known," William said. "No," she said. "But I saw, and I remember." She looked at Clara. "I'll say it to whoever needs to hear it. I'll go to Richmond myself if that's what's required." Clara looked at this woman, this sharp, capable, fiercely loyal woman who had protected William's household with her knowledge of back channels and her ability to read a room and her unwillingness to let things go unnoticed. And she felt a surge of something that was almost too big for the kitchen, for the ordinary summer morning around them. "You won't have to go to Richmond," Clara said. "Crane can take your deposition here. But Mrs. Adler," she paused, "this matters enormously. What you saw, it closes the last gap." "I know what it closes," Mrs. Adler said. "I've known for 2 years that I saw something wrong and couldn't name what it was. Now I can name it." She straightened. "I am very glad to name it." William crossed the kitchen and did something Clara had never seen him do. He put his hand briefly on Mrs. Adler's shoulder. One hand, one moment, wordless. And she looked up at him, and something passed between them that had 20 years of loyalty in it. Then he stepped back and said to Clara, "Write to Crane today." "I'm writing to Crane now," she said. She was already moving. Crane came to Harrington Estate himself, which was not usual. Clara understood it as a signal that the case had escalated past what could be managed by correspondence. He arrived in a Richmond carriage on a Wednesday afternoon with a clerk, his own case of documents, and an expression that was as close to animated as she'd seen on him. He sat in the study, and he looked at the documents Clara had assembled in response to Caldwell's counterfiling. Mrs. Adler's account, the medical record from the local physician who had attended Thomas Harrington Sr. through his last year and would testify to his cognitive decline, and a letter that Clara had found in the estate's own records, dated October 1815, in which William's father had written to a cousin in Maryland and described being asked to sign papers he didn't fully understand, saying Caldwell's men were here again, and I signed what they put before me because I was too tired to argue. And Crane read everything with the focused silence of a man assembling a final argument. When he finished, he looked at Clara. "You found the letter," he said. "It was in the estate correspondence file. I've been through every piece of paper in this house." She held his gaze. "It was misfiled under household receipts. I don't think Caldwell knew it existed." "It's a first-person account of coercion," Crane said, "in the victim's own hand." He set it down carefully. "Mrs. Harrington, I've been practicing law in Virginia for 22 years. I've had perhaps 4 cases in that time where the evidence was this complete. You've built one from a standing start in 6 weeks." "7, she said. "7, he agreed. He permitted himself a small, dry smile. "I will have this before the federal commissioner by Friday. Caldwell's counterfiling will not survive the week." William, from the chair beside Clara, said, "And the western parcel?" "Restored to the Harrington estate by the end of the month," Crane said, formally and on record. The room held that for a moment. The weight of what had been taken and what was being returned. The 2 years of work and loss, and the 7 weeks of a different kind of work that had brought it here. William looked at Clara. She looked back at him. She thought about the morning she'd walked into his study, with her father's ledger and her written apology, and 3 miles of summer road behind her. She thought about the question he'd asked, "What are you here to do?" and the answer she'd given. She thought about every morning since, at the desk with the notebooks and the evidence and the slow, patient architecture of a case that now sat on Aldous Crane's table, ready to be handed to a federal commissioner. She had walked in to apologize for her sister's mistake. She had built something neither of them had expected. Caldwell was formally charged by the federal commission on a Friday. Beal's holding company was placed under inquiry the same day. Josiah Pratt entered a cooperation agreement with the federal attorney's office the following Monday. The 3 fraudulent deed transfers on Ridgeline Road were flagged for review, and the families affected, including the Hollises, who had moved to Tennessee and received a letter through the county registry informing them that they had grounds to reclaim, were notified. The Whitmore mortgage, which William had paid in full, was marked satisfied in the county record. The 40-acre western parcel was returned to the Harrington estate by the end of the month, exactly as Crane had said. Clara sat at the... On the evening the formal restoration documents arrived, and she put them in order, and she labeled the file, and she put it in the locked drawer. Then she sat for a while without doing anything at all. She thought about what it was to finish something. She had always moved from task to task, from crisis to crisis, from one set of accounts to the next set of accounts, without the particular stillness that came when a thing was actually complete. This was complete. Not the legal process, which would take months longer to fully resolve. Caldwell would be tried. Beal would cooperate to reduce his own liability. Pratt's testimony would be entered. But the shape of it was set. The outcome was not in doubt. She opened the notebook to the page that said, "What we built," and she looked at the list. It was longer than she'd expected when she started it. That was usually the way. William found her there. He came to the study doorway at 8 o'clock, and she was sitting at the desk with the notebook and the locked drawer and the particular expression of someone who has just put down a weight that was heavier than they'd admitted while they were carrying it. He came in. He sat in the second chair, the one he'd pulled around on the first morning, and never moved back. "Done?" he said. "Done enough," she said. "For tonight." He nodded. He looked at the desk, then at her. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want you to hear it without deflecting it." She straightened slightly. "All right. You came here in July with a satchel and an apology that wasn't yours to make," he said. "And in 7 weeks you saved this estate, exposed a fraud that had been operating for 6 years, protected 4 families. I had no way of protecting on my own, and built a federal case that 22 years of Aldous Crane's experience says is the most complete he's received." He held her eyes. "I want you to hear that. Not as a compliment. As a fact. She held it. She didn't deflect it. I also want to say, he continued, that I had terms when I made the proposal in July. I said it was a business arrangement to begin with. He stopped. I'd like to renegotiate the terms. She looked at him. What terms are you proposing? She said. No terms, he said. That's the point. I'm proposing that we stop calling it an arrangement entirely. He leaned forward, forearms on his knees, the way he leaned when he was thinking hard and had stopped managing his posture. I'm proposing that what this is, whatever it's become, we let it be that without a contract around it. She was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the kitchen at 11 o'clock, the bread and the dark, and the space between their arms on the work table. She thought about the morning she'd told him, I know what it was when you asked me, and he'd said, I'm less certain what it is now. She thought about every evening at the desk, every argument about strategy, every moment when he'd said something honest, and she'd felt it land in a place she hadn't expected. She thought about being 19 years old and looking at her father's accounts and deciding that someone had to understand where every dollar went, and it was going to have to be her. She thought about how long she had been the person who carried things without being asked to carry them, who understood without being thanked for understanding, who solved problems in rooms where no one acknowledged they were being solved. She thought about what it was to be in a room with a man who saw her solving them, who moved his chair around to the same side of the desk, who wrote to Richmond in her name because that was how the law worked and didn't make a ceremony of the injustice, who said stop deflecting credit in the dark of a carriage ride home. She thought about what she deserved. She had been thinking about that for a while. It was harder than thinking about what other people needed. I'm not good at being chosen, she said finally. I'm good at choosing, at deciding what needs to be done and doing it. Someone choosing me is... She stopped. She started again. I don't have a lot of practice trusting that. I know, he said. I'm not good at it either. At choosing. I'm good at obligation, at responsibility, at things that have a clear reason behind them. He held her gaze. You're the first thing in a long time I've wanted without a clear reason. It took me a while to trust that. She looked at him. That's honest, she said. It's the only thing I know how to be, he said. You know that by now. She did know that. It was one of the first things she'd learned, and one of the things she had come to rest on the most heavily, without realizing how much she'd been resting on it until this moment. No terms, she said. No terms, he agreed. She held his eyes across the desk for a long moment. Then she stood and walked around to his side of the desk, and she stopped in front of him, and he looked up at her, and she took his face in both her hands, the way she did things when she'd decided, completely, without reservation, and she kissed him with all the plainness and honesty and patient certainty of a woman who had built a case from nothing and knew the difference between a fact and a feeling and had stopped treating them as separate. He kissed her back with the steadiness of a man who had been waiting for something without knowing he was waiting until it arrived. When she pulled back, she was still holding his face. I didn't plan for this either, she said. No, he said. His hands were at her waist, and his voice was rougher than usual. Neither did I. I'm glad, she said. So am I, he said. Clara. Her name in his voice, plain as anything. I'm very glad. She straightened. She smoothed her dress. She went back around to her side of the desk, because the notebooks were still there, and the case files still needed to be organized before Crane's next letter arrived, and she was constitutionally incapable of leaving work unfinished. But she was smiling. She realized she had been smiling for some time. September came in with cooler mornings and a harvest that was the strongest the Harrington estate had seen in 3 years. The Northfield drainage, the blocked channel that had been left deliberately by a man Caldwell had paid, was repaired in 2 days once William turned his full attention to it. Clara had been right about where the blockage was. She was usually right about where things were. The families on Ridgeline Road began the process of reviewing their deeds through Crane's office. It would take months. Some of them would recover what they'd lost. Some of them wouldn't. The Hollises, in Tennessee, wrote back to say they'd made a life and weren't coming home, but they wanted the record corrected And the record was corrected. Delia Morse accepted a position with a merchant firm in Richmond that needed a bookkeeper with an eye for irregularities and a reputation for honesty. She wrote Clara a letter that said, among other things, "I feel like I've put something down that I've been carrying since I was 21. I don't quite know who I am without it yet, but I think I'm going to enjoy finding out." Clara wrote back. She said, "That's exactly the right way to feel. The not knowing is where you start." Margaret Caldwell stayed in Harrington County. She was not ostracized. Harriet Wentworth saw to that, in the practical and thoroughgoing way she saw to most things. But her social position shifted, thinned, changed shape. She bore it with the composure of a woman who had made a choice she couldn't unmake and had stopped wanting to. She attended church. She kept her own counsel. Once, in the market, she and Clara stood at the same stall and exchanged a look that had more in it than either of them said, and that was all right. Some things were communicated better without words. Josephine Whitmore came to the estate in September for the first time since that morning on the porch. She came with their father, who had rallied through the summer and who sat in the parlor and talked with William about land management and the price of tobacco for an hour, with the focused alertness of a man whose mind had always been sharper than his body. When the men had exhausted the subject of tobacco, their father looked at Clara, who was sitting across from him with her coffee and her straight spine, and he said, "Are you happy?" She thought about it. She thought about the honor the question deserved. "Yes," she said. He looked at her face to see if it was true. He had always been able to tell. "Good," he said. "Then I'm not worried about the rest of it." Josephine, sitting beside him, looked at her hands and then looked at Clara and said, "It suits you here." "Yes," Clara said. "It does." She hadn't known that until she said it. But it was true. She could feel it was true. This house and its accounts and its fields and its problems, and the man who walked its north field at first light, and pulled his chair to the same side of the desk and said things plainly whether they were easy to say or not, it suited her. Not because she had shaped herself to fit it, because she had been herself in it, more fully than she'd been herself in any room she could remember, and it had held her without asking her to be smaller. The last piece of the legal case resolved in October. Thomas Caldwell pled to 3 counts of fraudulent land transfer before the Federal Commission, avoiding trial in exchange for cooperation. Beals Holding Company was dissolved. The state of Virginia recorded a formal finding of fraud against Meridian Land Associates and all associated shell companies. The county magistrates, who had been in Caldwell's pocket, were not charged. The evidence against them didn't rise to the federal threshold. But 2 of them retired before the year was out, and the 3rd was not reappointed. People in the county had long memories, and they were paying attention now. Josiah Pratt received a reduced finding in exchange for his full cooperation and testimony. He moved to Maryland, and as far as Clara knew, he never returned to Virginia. She bore him no particular feeling, not forgiveness, not resentment. He had made the only correct choice available to him, and the cost of making it earlier would have been less, and he knew that, and she suspected that knowledge was its own kind of consequence. Aldous Crane sent a final letter in November that was 1 page and ended. "The matter is concluded. I have been practicing law for 22 years, and this is the first case in which the primary architect of the evidence was someone who was not employed as a lawyer and not invited to be named in the official record. I find that unjust. I intend to say so publicly. You should know that I have already said so to 3 colleagues in Richmond, and that your name is not unknown in those offices." Clara read the letter at the desk, and then she read the last paragraph again. She folded it carefully and put it in the file labeled, "What We Built." She went downstairs. William was in the front hall putting on his coat for the morning field walk, and she handed him the letter without a word. He read it, he folded it, he handed it back. 3 colleagues in Richmond, he said. So he says. How do you feel about that? She thought about it. She thought about being 19 and bending over a ledger with eyes that ached and a family that didn't know they needed to worry. She thought about walking 3 miles in July heat with an apology that wasn't hers. She thought about the August 1814 entry, $40, The thread she'd pulled and pulled until it unraveled a 6-year fraud. She thought about what she deserved. "I feel like it's accurate," she said. He put his hand briefly against her face. The same gesture she'd made in the study that night. The same plainness and certainty in it. And then he dropped it and turned toward the door. "Come walk with me," he said. She got her coat. They walked the north field in the October morning, the harvest done, the air cool and carrying the particular smell of turned earth and the last of the summer grass. She walked beside him, the way she'd been walking beside him for months now, matching his stride without having to adjust for it, which had happened gradually enough that she hadn't noticed it until it was simply true. He stopped at the place where the field sloped toward the western boundary, toward the 40 acres of river access land that had been taken and returned, that had been the beginning thread of the whole case, that his father had walked every spring, even after his knees went, because he believed in the land as a responsibility rather than a possession. She stood beside him and looked at it. "My father walked this boundary every March," William said. "I know," she said. "You told me." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the land with the particular expression of a man who was carrying someone else alongside his own seeing. "I walked it this spring," he said, "for the first time since he died. I walked it in March, before you came." A pause. "It felt different than I thought it would." "How?" "Smaller. Or I was larger. I don't know." He turned to look at her. "I walked it this morning, and it felt different again." She looked at him. "Because you were going to walk it with me after," he said. She held that. She let it land in the place where honest things landed when she was done managing them. "William," she said. "Clara," he said. She laughed. A real laugh, not the controlled social kind, the kind that came from somewhere she didn't keep managed, and it surprised her enough that she felt it in her chest like something opening. He looked at her with the expression she'd stopped trying to name and started simply accepting, the one that was particular to her, the one she'd watched develop over weeks and months from assessment to something warmer and more specific and more permanent. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Just, we are very alike in some ways that I did not expect." "Meaning?" "Meaning we're both people who do things because they need to be done and don't say what they're actually feeling until they've verified the structural integrity of the situation." She looked at him with the directness she'd stopped moderating. "I've verified it. I thought you should know." He held her gaze. "And?" he said. "And I love you," she said. Plainly. Without ceremony. The way she stated a fact that had been established and was no longer in question. He didn't flinch from it. He didn't look away. "I know," he said. And then, just as plainly, just as certainly, "I love you. I have been loving you since the morning you told me the August 1814 entry was your oversight, and you'd catch it now. Nobody has ever said that to me about a mistake they hadn't made, and I have never forgotten it." She looked at him. "That's very specific," she said. "I'm a specific person," he said. "So am I," she said. "You should know. I intend to keep working. The families on Ridgeline Road, the deeds, the accounts. I'm not going to become less than I am because the emergency is over." "I know that," he said. "I pulled my chair around to your side of the desk in the first week. Did you think that was temporary?" She had thought about that, more than she'd said. "No," she said. "I didn't." He offered her his arm, the way he had at Harriet Wentworth's dinner. She took it, the way she had then. They stood at the edge of the western boundary field for another moment, looking at land that had been stolen and recovered, at a horizon that was wide and clear and open. Then they walked back together, toward the house that had started as the terms of an arrangement and become something that held both of them, their history and their work, and the particular shape of who they were when they were being most themselves. Years later, when people in Harrington County talked about the Caldwell case, and they did talk about it, it was the kind of story that earned its permanence. They talked about William Harrington and the federal inquiry and Aldous Crane's argument before the Land Commission. That was how it was recorded. That was the name in the official file. But the families on Ridgeline Road knew whose hands had gone through the documents. The clerk at the county registry knew who had found the Meridian deed. Delia Morse knew. Margaret Caldwell knew. Josiah Pratt, in Maryland, knew. Harriet Wentworth knew, and she had the particular satisfaction of someone who had been watching closely enough to see what others missed. Mrs. Adler knew. She had always known. She had pulled Clara's chair to the right side of every room in the house, in the ways that were hers to pull it, from the beginning, and William Harrington knew. He had known since the first morning she'd walked around to his side of the desk without being invited, since the night she'd found the deed in the dark study, with the candle burning low, since the morning she'd said I had good source material when a lawyer with 22 years of practice told her she'd done something remarkable. He knew, and he had spent every day since making sure she knew that he knew, in the way that was his, in plain speech and pulled chairs and a hand against her face, and the simple, specific fact of choosing her every morning because he wanted to. Clara Whitmore Harrington had walked into a powerful man's house to apologize for someone else's mistake, with nothing behind her but a leather satchel and 7 years of knowing where every dollar went, and the particular courage of a woman who had decided that invisible labor was not the same as worthless labor, and that she was done letting anyone treat those two things as synonyms. She had walked out with his name. She had earned, in the months that followed, something that mattered more, the knowledge that the name had not made her, that she had made herself, carefully, over years, in the quiet rooms where the real work was done, and that what she had become was worth choosing. Not in spite of the ledgers and the early mornings and the courage it took to look at a hard number and not look away from it, but because of all of it. She was not a woman who had been rescued. She was a woman who had walked in, looked clearly at what was broken, and built something better than what was there before. And she knew it. That was the thing that lasted.